You might look up at the moon on a clear night and see, well, a glowing symbol of human achievement.
Right, a testament to our boundless curiosity.
Exactly. It feels so peaceful up there. But today, we are going to look at the night sky through a completely different lens.
A much darker one.
Yeah. We are going to look at it as the ultimate Cold War battleground.
Which fundamentally changes how you view those early triumphs. I mean, when you strip away the romance and the polished public relations campaigns of the mid-20th century.
The black and white photos of smiling astronauts, right?
Exactly. The early days of space exploration were not born out of some noble, unified desire to touch the stars. They were forged in the fires of geopolitical paranoia and, well, military rivalry.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to truly understand how human beings managed to leave this planet, we have to acknowledge a very uncomfortable, honestly terrifying historical truth.
It is terrifying.
Everything we know about orbital mechanics, satellite technology, and deep space travel started with weapons of mass destruction.
That is the undeniable foundation.
Right. So we are going to trace this entire timeline, impartially breaking down the triumphs and the darkest, most closely guarded secrets of both the United States and the Soviet Union.
And we should clarify, our goal isn't to take a political stance on capitalism versus communism here.
No, not at all. The mission of this deep dive is to uncover the raw engineering and the sheer psychological pressure that pushed humanity into the cosmos.
And to do that, we really can't start our story in space.
Right, we have to start in the rubble of World War II.
We do, because the vehicles that eventually carried humans to the stars, they were originally engineered to deliver explosives to European cities.
It's wild to think about.
It is. If you want to trace the technological lineage of the modern space age, all roads lead back to Nazi Germany. Specifically, they lead to a weapon called the V-2 rocket.
Developed by Wernher von Braun, right?
Yes, von Braun and his engineering team at Peenemünde.
And for anyone unfamiliar with the V-2, it wasn't just like another bomb. It was a technological leap that changed the paradigm of warfare literally overnight.
It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. I mean, before the V-2, if you wanted to bomb London, you had to fly a heavy bomber across the English Channel.
Right. Brave the anti-aircraft fire, evade fighter planes, and then physically drop the payload.
Exactly. The V-2 bypassed all of that. It was launched from the continent, flew right to the edge of space at supersonic speeds, and just plunged down on its target.
And because it was traveling faster than the speed of sound?
You didn't even hear it coming until after it had already exploded.
Wow.
It was absolute unstoppable terror from above.
So the war ends in 1945. The Third Reich collapses. And suddenly you have these two emerging global superpowers.
The United States and the Soviet Union.
Right, standing in the ashes of Europe. They look at this V-2 technology, they look at the destruction it caused, and they both instantly realize that the future of global dominance doesn't belong to airplanes anymore.
No, airplanes were suddenly obsolete in that strategic sense. It belongs to rocketry.
So what happened? I mean, they just scramble for the tech.
It triggered an immediate, frantic scramble. Both nations knew they had to capture not just the remaining physical V-2 rockets, but the minds that actually conceived them.
The engineers.
Right. The United States launched a highly classified intelligence program called Operation Paperclip.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, they successfully located and recruited Wernher von Braun and a massive contingent of his top scientists. The U.S. military brought them to White Sands, New Mexico.
And what did they tell them? Just build us rockets.
Essentially, yes. They said, reassemble these captured V-2s, show our engineers exactly how the plumbing and the guidance systems work, and, build us an American rocket program.
Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is running its own parallel intelligence operation, like in their occupation zone.
They absolutely were. The Soviets managed to capture several key V-2 production facilities and testing grounds that fell within their territory.
Did they get scientists too?
They did. They rounded up a significant group of German aerospace experts who hadn't made it to the American lines. The most notable of these was a team led by Helmut Grittrup.
Who was he?
A brilliant guidance control engineer. The Soviet military essentially packed Grittrup and his team onto trains, sent them deep into the Soviet Union, and ordered them to help jumpstart the Soviet rocketry initiative.
But the way the two countries utilized these captured scientists was fundamentally different, right? Which kind of sets the stage for everything that follows.
It's a critical divergence. I mean, the Americans eventually integrated von Braun into the very core of their aerospace infrastructure.
He became like the public face of the U.S. space program.
Exactly. But the Soviet strategy was much more insular. They used Grothrup and his German colleagues to understand the V-2, asking them to draft designs for improved versions.
So they just learned from them.
Yeah. The Soviets built an exact replica of the V-2, which they called the R-1 rocket. But once the Soviet engineers, under the leadership of their own fiercely brilliant chief designer, Sergei Korolev...
Wait, Sergei Korolev?
Yes, remember that name. He's central to this. Once Korolev and his team felt they had extracted all the necessary knowledge, they completely isolated the German scientists. Really? Just shut them out.
Completely. The Soviets wanted their advanced rockets to be purely indigenous designs.
So the starting gun for the space race wasn't fired on a launch pad with a countdown. It was fired in the chaotic intelligence gathering of 1945.
That's a great way to put it.
But what turns this from just like an engineering exercise into an existential crisis is the nuclear arms race.
The ultimate game changer.
Right. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonates its first nuclear weapon, the RDS-1. Now, both the U.S. and the USSR possess the ultimate bomb.
But having a nuclear weapon is only half the geopolitical equation.
Because you have to be able to deliver it to your enemy's doorstep.
Exactly. And in the early 1950s, the only delivery method was a strategic bomber.
Which, like we said, are slow. They could be tracked by radar networks.
Or intercepted by fighter squadrons, or shot out of the sky by surface-to-air missiles. Both superpowers recognized that if you could miniaturize a nuclear warhead enough to put it on the tip of a massive rocket.
An intercontinental ballistic missile. An ICBM. Yes, an ICBM. If you could do that, you change the rules of engagement. You could launch a weapon from your own soil, send it up into the vacuum of space where there is no air resistance.
And have it strike a target on the opposite side of the planet in, what, 30 minutes?
Roughly 30 minutes, yes.
It's the ultimate unblockable punch. I mean, you're not sending a delivery truck. You're building a FedEx overnight tube that travels through the exosphere.
That's terrifyingly accurate. There was absolutely no defense against an ICBM in the 1950s. If it launched, the target was obliterated. Period.
Which creates this frantic, terrifying missile race. And this is where the engineering paths of the two nations start to diverge in a way that accidentally dictates the entire early space race.
It really was an accident of engineering.
We have to look closely at the specific missiles they were building to understand why the Soviet Union took such a massive early lead in space.
The differences in those early ICBMs really just come down to payload weight.
Okay, break that down for us.
In 1953, Sergei Korolev and his design bureau began developing the Soviet Union's first true ICBM, the R-7 Semyorka.
The R-7.
Right. At this point in history, Soviet nuclear physicists were still refining their bomb designs. The thermonuclear warhead they intended to place on the R-7 was massive.
Like how massive?
Rudimentary and incredibly heavy. We are talking about a payload weighing between 5.5 and 6 metric tons.
Oh, wow. Which is an absurd amount of dead weight to try and push into the upper atmosphere.
It required a behemoth of a launch vehicle. I mean, to lift a 6-ton warhead across the globe, Korolev couldn't just build a taller rocket. He had to rethink the thrust mechanics entirely.
So what did he do?
The R-7 wasn't a single pencil-shaped tube. It was a cluster design. It featured a massive central core surrounded by 4 strap-on booster rockets.
Oh, so they all fire at once.
Yes, they would ignite simultaneously on the launch pad and then fall away as the rocket gained altitude. At liftoff, the R-7 generated an astonishing initial thrust of over 400 tons.
400 tons.
It was raw, brute force engineering.
Now, contrast that with what the United States was doing at the exact same time. The U.S. was developing the Atlas missile.
Right.
But American physicists had achieved a breakthrough in warhead miniaturization, right?
Yeah.
Their nuclear bombs were significantly lighter and much more compact.
Which changed everything for the rocket designers. Therefore, the American aerospace engineers didn't need to build a 400-ton thrust monster. They could build something sleeker.
And they took that mandate for a lightweight vehicle to an extreme.
Oh, they absolutely did. The Atlas missile featured what engineers call a balloon tank design.
A balloon tank.
Yeah. Most rockets have a rigid internal framework, like the skeleton of a building, with the fuel tank sitting inside.
Makes sense.
The Atlas designers stripped all of that internal bracing away to save weight. The outer skin of the rocket was just very thin stainless steel.
Wait, so what kept it from crumpling?
The missile actually relied on the internal pressure of its own fuel and nitrogen gas to keep it from collapsing under its own weight.
So it's literally like a pressurized balloon. I mean, if you take the air out of a balloon, it goes limp. If you let the pressure out of an Atlas missile on the launch pad, the entire multi-million-dollar rocket would just crumple into a pile of steel foil.
Exactly. It would just collapse. The obsession with weight saving on the Atlas was so intense that they didn't even want to add the weight of a coat of paint.
Which created a massive logistical headache.
A huge one.
Because these rockets were being tested and staged on the coast of Florida at Cape Canaveral. You have bare stainless steel sitting in the hot, incredibly humid, salty ocean air.
The missiles began to rust before they could even be launched.
And this leads to one of my absolute favorite bizarre historical connections. The aerospace contractors realized they needed some kind of chemical solvent, like a water displacement formula.
Right, to wipe down the outside of the Atlas rockets and protect the bare steel from the Florida humidity without adding the weight of paint.
Exactly. So they handed the problem to a small chemical company in San Diego. The chemists tried dozens of different mixtures. Formula 1 failed. Formula 20 failed.
They just kept trying?
Finally, on their 40th attempt, they perfected the chemical makeup. Water displacement 40th formula. WD-40.
It's an amazing story.
The exact same blue and yellow can sitting under your kitchen sink right now, which you use to fix a squeaky door hinge, was literally invented to stop early American nuclear missiles from rusting on the launch pad.
It perfectly illustrates how high-stakes military problem-solving bleeds into everyday consumer technology.
It's wild.
But to bring the focus back to the aerospace engineering, the disparity in size between the Atlas and the R-7 is the single most important factor of the late 1950s.
Because they were built for totally different bombs.
Exactly. The American Atlas was an elegant, highly optimized, lightweight missile meant to carry a light weapon. The Soviet R-7 was a brute force Leviathan designed to carry an exceptionally heavy weapon.
So essentially, none of this initial rocketry was a noble quest for scientific knowledge.
Not even a little bit.
To use an analogy, it's like two extremely paranoid neighbors deciding to build increasingly massive sniper rifles to aim at each other's living rooms.
That's a good way to picture it.
But then, one day, they suddenly decide to point those same rifles up at the sky and shoot apples into orbit, just to prove to the rest of the neighborhood how incredibly powerful their weapons are.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that analogy highlights the accidental Soviet advantage.
Right.
When the geopolitical goals shifted from just threatening each other to actually placing a satellite in orbit, payload disparity became everything.
Because satellites are heavy.
Exactly. If you want to launch a satellite, especially a heavy one filled with scientific instruments, you need a heavy lift launch vehicle. The Soviet Union already had one sitting on the pad.
The R-7.
Right. The R-7 was perfectly suited for space exploration by sheer accident of its nuclear requirements. The United States did not have a heavy lift vehicle ready.
And the staggering part of this is that the U.S. intelligence community was completely blind to this Soviet advantage. I mean, the CIA entirely misjudged what Sergei Korolev was building.
They really did. They suffered from a classic intelligence failure known as mirror imaging.
Mirror imaging? What's that?
It's when you assume your adversary thinks and builds exactly like you do. When the CIA analysts tried to estimate Soviet rocket capabilities, they looked at their own highly optimized, lightweight American Atlas rocket.
Oh, I see.
And they wrongly assumed the Soviets must be following the exact same engineering philosophy.
So when the Soviets eventually began launching massive, heavy satellites, the CIA was just utterly bewildered.
They couldn't understand it. They worked the math backward from the weight of the objects in orbit and concluded the Soviet rockets must weigh an impossible 500 metric tons and operate on some three-stage system they couldn't fathom.
They just couldn't wrap their heads around the cluster design.
Because they refused to believe the Soviets would build something so drastically different. What makes this intelligence failure even worse is that the CIA actually had human intelligence warning them about this.
Wait, they did?
Remember Helmut Gottrup, the German scientist the Soviets took?
Oh, right. The one who helped build the R-1.
Exactly. He eventually returned to the West. He sat down with Western intelligence and explicitly told them that Soviet engineers were utilizing completely different design concepts.
He told them they were doing it differently.
Yes. Different thrust-to-weight ratios, prioritizing different systems than the Americans. But the CIA analysts dismissed him.
You're kidding.
They ignored the human intelligence because it conflicted with their own rigid engineering assumptions.
That hubris perfectly sets up the massive psychological shock that the American public is about to endure. Because as we move into the mid-1950s, all of these giant ICBMs are being built, tested, and occasionally exploding in deep secrecy.
Lots of explosions.
But the Cold War wasn't just a military standoff. It was a sprawling global ideological theater. You couldn't just have weapons hidden in silos.
No, you had to actively demonstrate to the unaligned nations of the world that your system of government produced superior technology, superior intellect, and, well, a superior future.
So the transition from secret missiles to highly visible public satellites was inevitable.
The catalyst for that transition really arrived in the summer of 1955.
What happened then?
The international scientific community was organizing the International Geophysical Year. It was a massive, coordinated global effort to study the Earth and its environment, scheduled to run from 1957 to 1958.
Okay.
Seizing the opportunity to demonstrate technological prowess under the banner of peaceful science, the White House announced in July 1955 that the United States intended to launch small, Earth-circling satellites as their primary contribution to this global initiative.
It was a very confident, very public declaration. But the Soviet response was incredibly swift, wasn't it?
It took exactly 5 days.
5 days.
Less than a week after the American announcement, a Soviet scientist attending an astrophysics conference in Copenhagen casually mentioned to a group of international reporters that the USSR also intended to launch a satellite in the near future.
Just casually drop that in?
Yeah, but that casual announcement was actually the result of intense internal lobbying. Sergei Korolev used the American press release as leverage.
If you played the political game?
Masterfully. He went to the Soviet Academy of Sciences and the Politburo and essentially argued the Americans have declared their intentions. If we do not fund a satellite program immediately, they will beat us, and it will be a global embarrassment for international communism.
And it worked.
It worked perfectly. He successfully secured the funding purely on the basis of beating the United States.
But the way these two nations handled the public relations of this impending space race couldn't have been more different. Let's examine the Soviet strategy first, because it relied on a concept that historians call the space curtain.
Right, the space curtain. The Soviet Union managed its entire space exploration initiative as a top-secret military operation.
There was no, civilian space agency in the USSR.
No. Korolev's design bureau was directly subordinated to the Ministry of General Machine Building.
Which sounds incredibly vague.
It was designed to be. It was the exact same ministry responsible for building the nuclear ICBMs. The space curtain was a policy of absolute impenetrable secrecy beforehand. They revealed nothing.
So no public countdowns, no press conferences?
Never. Launches were never scheduled publicly. A launch was only announced to the world by the state news agency TSS after the satellite was already safely in orbit.
That is wild.
The identities of the chief designers, including Korolev himself, were considered state secrets. Even the physical appearance of the R-7 rocket was hidden from the global public for years.
It's a brilliant, if deceptive, propaganda strategy. I mean, you only ever show the world your flawless victories.
Precisely.
If a rocket blew up on the pad, and we know now that many of them did, the world simply never heard about it. It created this terrifying, monolithic illusion that the Soviet engineering apparatus was infallible.
Winston Churchill once described the actions of the Soviet Union as a riddle, wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma.
That's a perfect quote for this.
It perfectly encapsulates their space program. They projected absolute technological dominance simply by hiding all of their failures in the dark.
Meanwhile, in the United States, President Dwight D. Eisenhower is operating under a completely different framework with a totally different set of anxieties.
Very different anxieties.
It's common in pop history to hear Eisenhower criticized for lacking vision, for letting the Soviets beat America to space because he just didn't care about satellites.
I hear that all the time.
But that's a profound misreading of history, isn't it? Eisenhower was intensely focused on the space race, but his primary concern was international law.
This is perhaps the most crucial nuance of the early space age. You really have to put yourself in the legal mindset of the 1950s. For decades, international law recognized that a nation's sovereign airspace extended directly up from its borders.
Right. If you fly over France, you're in French airspace.
Exactly. But nobody had defined where airspace ended and where outer space began. Eisenhower was looking at the reality of the Cold War and realized that eventually the United States was going to need to launch spy satellites to photograph Soviet military installations from orbit.
Because flying U-2 spy planes through Soviet airspace was incredibly dangerous and highly illegal.
Exactly. Eisenhower was deeply afraid that if the United States took a military ICBM, strapped a satellite to it, and launched it into an orbit that passed directly over Moscow, the Soviet leadership would rightfully point out that an American military weapon was overflying their sovereign territory.
They could consider it an act of war.
They could shoot it down and spark World War III.
So how do you solve a legal problem that has literally never existed in the history of human jurisprudence?
You establish a new legal precedent. Eisenhower wanted to firmly establish the concept of freedom of space.
Okay, what does that mean practically?
Well, there is a boundary, roughly 62 miles above sea level, known as the Kármán line. Theodore von Kármán, an aerospace engineer, calculated that at this altitude, the Earth's atmosphere becomes so thin that an airplane would have to travel faster than orbital velocity just to generate enough aerodynamic lift to stay aloft.
So effectively, aerodynamics ends and orbital mechanics begins.
Exactly. Eisenhower wanted international law to recognize that above the Kármán line, national borders simply do not apply. Space belongs to everyone, much like international waters in the middle of the ocean.
And his method for establishing this precedent was incredibly calculated.
It was a geopolitical masterstroke. To ensure that the first American satellite wouldn't be perceived as a military threat, Eisenhower explicitly ordered that it could not be launched on a military weapon.
Wait, but von Braun had military rockets ready, right?
He did. Wernher von Braun had the Jupiter C rocket, derived from the Redstone military missile, sitting in the hangar, essentially ready to go. But Eisenhower told him to stand down.
Must have driven von Braun crazy.
Oh, he was furious. Instead, the president mandated that the first U.S. satellite must be launched on the Vanguard rocket, a brand new, highly complex, untried research rocket being developed by the Naval Research Laboratory strictly for civilian scientific purposes.
I want to highlight the genius of this move.
Yeah.
We criticize Eisenhower for the delay, but his insistence on using a civilian rocket was a trap.
It really was.
By waiting, he essentially allowed the Soviet Union to launch first. And when the Soviets launched their satellite on their R-7 military ICBM, and that satellite flew directly over the United States, Washington didn't object.
They didn't declare war?
They didn't declare war. They simply tracked it and congratulated the scientists. By doing so, the United States trapped the Soviet Union into establishing the precedent of freedom of space.
It's brilliant diplomacy.
The Soviets couldn't claim the U.S. was violating their airspace with future spy satellites because the Soviets had already violated everyone else's airspace first.
Eisenhower prioritized the long-term, vital strategic ability to conduct orbital reconnaissance over the short-term propaganda victory of being first. He willingly absorbed the public relations blow to secure the ultimate high ground.
And what a massive public relations blow it was. Let's talk about the launch that changed the world. October 4th, 1957. What's fascinating about Sputnik 1 is that the tiny metal ball we all recognize wasn't even the machine Sergei Korolev originally intended to send into space.
Not at all. Korolev's original plan was grand. He wanted to launch a massive, highly sophisticated 1,400-kilogram orbital laboratory designated Object D.
1,400 kilograms. That's huge.
He knew his R-7 rocket was incredibly powerful, and he wanted a payload that proved it. Object D was packed with scientific instruments to measure radiation, magnetic fields, and atmospheric density.
So what happened?
Building something that complex takes time, and as 1957 dragged on, Object D fell further and further behind schedule due to severe manufacturing delays.
And Korolev starts feeling the heat. He's getting intelligence briefings that the Americans are making progress.
He was intensely paranoid that Wernher von Braun was going to launch a Jupiter C and steal the prize. He couldn't wait for Object D to be finished. So in February 1957, Korolev made a massive pivot.
He just scrapped it.
Temporarily, yes.
Ooh.
He went back to the Soviet Council of Ministers and asked for permission to build something he called a prostejny Sputnik, which translates roughly to simplest satellite.
Simplest satellite.
He stripped away all the complex science. He essentially said, just give me a metal ball, put a radio transmitter inside it, and let's get it on the rocket so we can claim the record.
Which resulted in the Sputnik 1 design. It was incredibly rudimentary. A highly polished aluminum alloy sphere, about 23 inches in diameter, roughly the size of a beach ball.
And it weighed just under 84 kilograms.
It had 4 long antennas trailing behind it. It contained no cameras, no complex sensors. Its entire purpose was to survive the launch and broadcast a simple, continuous radio pulse on 2 frequencies, 20 megahertz and 40 megahertz.
Frequencies that were easily picked up by amateur ham radio operators all over the world. Beep, beep, beep.
So launch day arrives.
On the night of Friday, October 4th, 1957, The modified R-7 ICBM roared to life on the launch pad at Tyuratam in the Kazakh steppe. Inside the launch control bunker, the atmosphere was incredibly tense.
Because they couldn't just watch it go to orbit.
No, when the rocket cleared the tower, there was no cheering. They had to wait for 95 agonizing minutes for the satellite to complete its first full orbit around the Earth and pass over the Soviet tracking stations again.
That wait must have been excruciating.
It was only when the radio operators heard that distinct beep, beep, beep fading in from the sky that the room finally erupted. They had done the impossible.
Interestingly, the initial Soviet media reaction the next morning was quite muted. Pravda ran a relatively small article. It wasn't until the Soviet leadership saw the absolute explosive panic happening in the West that they realized the magnitude of their propaganda victory.
The reaction in the West was visceral.
And that panic triggers what historians call the Sputnik crisis. I mean, imagine being an American in 1957. You've been told your whole life that your country is the undisputed king of industry and technology. And suddenly you walk out to your backyard at night, look up at the stars, and realize that a nation you've been told is backward. An agrarian has placed a machine directly over your house, and there's absolutely nothing your military can do to stop it.
The psychological terror was profound. The assumption of American technological supremacy vanished overnight. The immediate logical leap for the general public and the politicians was terrifyingly simple.
If it can launch a ball.
Exactly. If the Soviet Union has a rocket powerful enough to put a metal sphere into orbit, they have a rocket powerful enough to drop a thermonuclear warhead on Washington, D.C. or New York City without any warning.
That's a chilling realization.
Bernard Baruch, a highly influential economist and presidential advisor, wrote an open letter capturing the national anxiety. He stated that while America had been obsessed with consumerism, building bigger cars and new household gadgets, the Soviet Union had focused on conquering the cosmos.
He really laid it out there.
He wrote, "America is worried. It should be."
The political pressure on President Eisenhower becomes unbearable. The public is demanding an immediate response. So Eisenhower is forced to order the Civilian Vanguard project to rush their timeline.
They desperately moved the launch date up to December 6, 1957.
The stakes couldn't be higher. The entire world is watching. Reporters from across the globe are gathered at Cape Canaveral. It's live on television. The countdown hits 0. The engines ignite. And what unfolds is arguably one of the most embarrassing moments in American engineering history.
It was a catastrophic, highly publicized disaster. The Vanguard rocket struggled to generate thrust. It lifted perhaps 3 or 4 feet off the launch pad, seemed to hover for a fraction of a second, and then the engine lost pressure.
Oh, no.
The massive rocket settled back down onto the structure, the fuel tanks ruptured, and the entire vehicle erupted into a towering fireball.
Live on TV.
Amidst the flaming wreckage, the tiny, grapefruit-sized Vanguard satellite was thrown clear, landed on the concrete, and began pathetically transmitting its tracking signal from the dirt.
The global press had an absolute field day. The headlines the next morning were brutal. They called it Flopnik, Stayputnik, Kaputnik.
The mockery was intense.
The sources mentioned that during a session at the United Nations shortly after, a Soviet delegate actually approached the U.S. representative and smugly offered American engineers technical assistance under a Soviet program designed for backwards developing nations.
The level of geopolitical trolling was off the charts.
It really was. It forced Eisenhower's hand. The civilian vanguard had failed publicly. He finally relented and gave Wernher von Braun the authorization he had been begging for.
Von Braun's team at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency dusted off the military-derived Jupiter-C rocket, modified it, and renamed it the Juno I.
And they finally succeed.
Yes. On January 31st, 1958, less than 2 months after the Vanguard Inferno, von Braun's team successfully launched Explorer 1 into orbit. America was finally in space.
And we shouldn't gloss over Explorer 1 because unlike Sputnik's simple radio beep, Explorer 1 actually conducted groundbreaking science.
It did. The American payload included a Geiger-Miller tube, an instrument designed by Dr. James Van Allen from the University of Iowa to measure cosmic rays.
So it was actually returning data.
Real scientific data. As Explorer 1 traveled through its highly elliptical orbit, the radiation it encountered was so intense that it completely saturated Van Allen's instrument, causing it to read 0.
It just broke the scale.
When the data was analyzed, it led to the discovery of what we now call the Van Allen radiation belts. Massive, donut-shaped zones of highly energized, charged particles that are trapped in place by the Earth's magnetic field. It was the first major scientific discovery of the space age.
But despite the scientific triumph of Explorer 1, the political damage inflicted by Sputnik was permanent. The U.S. government realized that their current structure, having the Army, Navy, and Air Force all running competing redundant space projects, was incredibly inefficient and prone to failure.
It was a bureaucratic mess.
Out of the ashes of the Sputnik panic, Washington mandated a massive structural overhaul. In July 1958, Congress passed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, officially dissolving the old advisory committees and creating a brand new, centralized civilian agency to manage the nation's space exploration. They created NASA.
Which proved to be one of the most consequential bureaucratic decisions of the 20th century.
Why is that?
By ripping the non-military space efforts out of the hands of the warring armed forces and consolidating all the top scientists, funding, and resources under one civilian roof, the United States created a focused powerhouse. This centralization of effort and standardization of goals would eventually become the decisive factor in outpacing the fragmented Soviet system.
Okay, so let's assess the board. The satellites are whizzing overhead. The legal precedent that space belongs to everyone is firmly established. NASA has been formed. The tension is escalating daily.
But satellites are just machines.
Exactly. You can only launch so many metal boxes before the geopolitical theater demands a new frontier. To truly prove your nation's superiority, you have to do something much more difficult and much more dangerous. You have to take a living, breathing creature and put it into the crosshairs of this orbital chess match.
Which brings us to the era of firsts and the dark illusion of perfection.
Before any engineer or politician would sign off on risking a human life, they had to understand the biological realities of the environment. The medical community knew almost nothing about how a mammalian body would react to prolonged weightlessness or the intense cosmic radiation above the atmosphere.
They had basic questions. Would they be able to swallow? Would their hearts fail? So both nations turned to animal test subjects. The United States, looking for physiological similarities to humans, focused heavily on primates.
And they started this very early. The first mammal in space wasn't launched during the Sputnik era. It was way back in 1949.
Yes. The U.S. launched a rhesus monkey named Albert II on a modified, captured V-2 rocket from White Sands on a suborbital trajectory.
Just to clarify for anyone wondering, suborbital means the rocket goes straight up, crosses the boundary of space, experiences a few minutes of weightlessness at the apex, and comes right back down like an artillery shell. It doesn't travel fast enough horizontally to achieve orbit.
Correct. Albert II survived the intense G-forces of the launch and the brief period of weightlessness, proving that a mammal could survive the journey into the vacuum. However, he died upon re-entry when the capsule's parachute system failed, and it impacted the desert floor.
The Soviet Union took a completely different approach to their biological testing. Instead of monkeys, they used stray dogs gathered from the streets of Moscow.
The engineers figured that a stray dog who had survived the harsh Russian winters was already tough, adaptable, and used to extreme stress.
And their most famous animal pioneer is Laika. Just 1 month after Sputnik 1, the Soviet leadership demanded another massive spectacle to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. So November 1957, they launched Sputnik 2 with Laika on board. Now, for decades, the story of Laika was heavily sanitized by the Soviet propaganda machine.
What's fascinating here is how effectively they controlled the narrative. The official narrative pushed by the state media was that Laika was a hero who lived for several days in orbit, providing invaluable biometric data to ground controllers. They claimed she eventually died peacefully when her life support oxygen supply slowly ran out. It was presented as a tragic but dignified end.
But they knew she wasn't coming back, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Soviet engineers knew the spacecraft wasn't designed with a re-entry heat shield. They lacked the technology at the time to bring a capsule safely back from orbital velocity, so they knew from the moment of launch that it was a one-way trip. But the specific details of her death were hidden deep behind that space curtain.
It wasn't until 2002, long after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the real story finally surfaced at a scientific congress. And it's incredibly grim.
The truth was that Laika did not die peacefully days later. She died in agony just hours into the flight, roughly during her 4th orbit.
What actually happened?
The rush to launch for the political anniversary meant the capsule's crude thermal control system was woefully inadequate. A piece of thermal insulation tore loose during the violent launch. As the spacecraft orbited in direct sunlight, the internal temperature skyrocketed. Laika died from extreme heat exhaustion and sheer panic.
That is just awful to hear.
Decades later, Oleg Gazenko, one of the senior Soviet scientists involved in the project, publicly expressed his deep remorse, stating, "Work with animals is a source of suffering to all of us. We did not learn enough from this mission to justify the death of the dog."
It's a heartbreaking reality that underscores a recurring theme of this era. The immense pressure from the political leadership forcing engineers to produce first, regardless of whether the technology was actually ready or safe. And this political pressure reaches an absolute boiling point when we transition to human spaceflight. April 12, 1961, the day a 27-year-old Soviet fighter pilot named Yuri Gagarin becomes a global icon.
Gagarin's flight aboard Vostok 1 is undeniably one of the greatest technical achievements in human history. He was the first human to cross the threshold of space and complete a full 108-minute orbit around the Earth. The physical courage required to strap into that rocket is hard to comprehend.
He had no idea what was going to happen to his body.
Exactly. But it's also important to understand the level of control he had. The medical doctors were genuinely terrified that the profound disorientation of zero gravity might cause a human pilot to go insane, suffer hallucinations, or become physically paralyzed. Therefore, the Vostok capsule was almost entirely automated. It was flown by ground control and onboard sequencers. Gagarin was essentially a highly trained cargo.
Though they did give him a sealed envelope with a mathematical code to unlock the manual controls, just in case the automatic systems failed entirely and he was facing certain death.
True, a small concession to the pilot's instinct. Gagarin returns to Earth a massive hero. The Soviet Union throws him ticker tape parades, he tours the world. But the actual spacecraft he rode in, the Vostok, is a masterclass in Soviet deception and dual-use engineering. The Soviet government went to extraordinary lengths to hide what the Vostok capsule actually looked like from the global public for years.
Why hide the very machine that brought you your greatest triumph?
Because the Vostok capsule wasn't a bespoke, purely scientific vessel. It was built using the exact same underlying architecture, what engineers call a spacecraft bus, as the highly classified Soviet Zenit spy satellites.
Wait, it was a spy satellite?
A spacecraft bus is essentially the standardized chassis of a satellite containing the power systems, propulsion, and structural framework upon which you can mount different payloads. Korolev designed the Zenit spy satellite to carry high-resolution cameras to photograph the U.S. and return the film to Earth in a spherical re-entry capsule. To save time and money for the human program, he simply took that spy satellite chassis, pulled out the cameras, and shoved a life support system and a human seat inside.
So if they showed the world the Vostok, they would be handing Western intelligence agencies a detailed blueprint of their top-secret orbital reconnaissance platform.
Exactly. They were so paranoid about this that during a major international air show in Tushino in 1961, they displayed a fake Vostok spaceship to the public. They deliberately left a large aerodynamic nose cone attached to hide the true spherical shape of the re-entry capsule. They even bolted 8 fake tail fins onto the booster stage, just to hopelessly confuse any CIA analysts analyzing the photographs. The level of misdirection is astonishing.
Meanwhile, back in Washington, the Gagarin flight hits the newly sworn-in Kennedy administration like a tidal wave. The U.S. is scrambling to respond. Less than a month after Gagarin's orbital flight on May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard climbs into the tiny Project Mercury capsule, Freedom 7, and becomes the first American in space.
Shepard's flight was a vital psychological response for the American public, but technologically it's important to differentiate the achievements. Gagarin achieved full orbital velocity, circling the globe. Shepard's flight was a suborbital ballistic trajectory.
Like Albert II.
Yes. His Redstone rocket essentially threw him straight up over the Atlantic Ocean, and he came straight back down about 15 minutes later. However, NASA made sure to heavily publicize a key distinction. Unlike Gagarin's automated ride, Shepard was the first human to take physical, manual control of his spacecraft's attitude, its pitch, yaw, and roll while in the vacuum of space.
The U.S. doesn't actually match Gagarin's orbital feat until John Glenn's flight in February 1962 aboard Friendship 7. But by this point, the U.S. has laid their Project Mercury cards on the table. They have a solid, well-engineered, functioning, single-person capsule. And this steady American progress starts to make the Soviet political leadership incredibly nervous.
They couldn't stand the steady progress.
Right. They can't just rest on Gagarin's laurels forever. The premier, Nikita Khrushchev, demands more firsts to keep the Americans in the rearview mirror. And this demand births the Voskhod program, which, when you read the engineering realities behind it, is absolutely terrifying.
It is the definition of reckless engineering driven entirely by political optics. Sergei Korolev was already hard at work designing the Soviet Union's next-generation spacecraft, the Soyuz. Soyuz was brilliant. It was designed from the ground up to carry multiple cosmonauts, perform orbital rendezvous, and eventually go to the moon.
That's great.
But Soyuz was still years away from being flight-ready. At the same time, NASA had publicly announced Project Gemini, an advanced two-person spacecraft that would soon begin flying. Khrushchev couldn't stand the idea of the Americans launching two men before the Soviets did. He ordered Korolev to launch a multi-person crew immediately.
But Korolev didn't have a multi-person spacecraft. He only had leftover, cramped, single-person Vostok capsules.
So Korolev had to perform a terrifying mechanical hack. He took a single-person Vostok capsule and ripped out the heavy ejection seat. Without the ejection seat, there was absolutely no way for the crew to escape if the rocket exploded on the pad or during early ascent. Then, he literally crammed 3 small couches into the tiny spherical cabin, mounting them sideways.
That's insane.
This horrifying contraption became Voskhod 1. When it launched in October 1964 with 3 men aboard, the Soviet propaganda machine went into overdrive. They touted it as a massive technological leap, specifically bragging to the world that their environmental life support systems were so advanced that the cosmonauts were flying in a shirt-sleeve environment without bulky spacesuits.
Which was a total lie. It wasn't a luxury. It was a desperate physical constraint.
Precisely. They flew without spacesuits because 3 inflated spacesuits literally could not fit inside the cabin. Or a valve had failed and the cabin depressurized, all 3 men would have died instantly. The blood in their veins would have boiled in the vacuum. They had 0 backup systems. It was an immense risk taken solely to claim the headline, First multi-crew flight.
It's like entering an F1 race with a car that has 3 people shoved into the driver's seat, no seatbelts, and no fire extinguishers, just so you can say you fit the most people in the car. It's madness. If the global public knew how close these Soviet missions came to catastrophic failure, would they have still seemed like the undisputed winners at this stage?
They likely wouldn't have. But what's fascinating is how robust the Soviet illusion of perfection was. The world bought it completely. And buoyed by that success, the Soviets pushed their luck even further with Voskhod 2 in March 1965.
Another first.
The political mandate this time was to achieve the first spacewalk, or extravehicular activity, before the American Gemini astronauts could do it. Since the Voskhod capsule couldn't be depressurized without killing the other crew member, Korolev's engineers strapped a collapsible, inflatable fabric airlock to the outside of the hull. Alexei Leonov crawled into it, pressurized his suit, opened the outer hatch, and floated out into the void.
The photographs of Leonov floating over the Earth are breathtaking. But the reality of what was happening to his body and his suit is a nightmare.
The environment of space is aggressively hostile. When Leonov was outside, the pressure differential between the vacuum of space and the oxygen inside his suit caused the stiff fabric of his spacesuit to balloon outward uncontrollably. The suit became completely rigid, like a pressurized tire. His hands slipped out of his gloves, his feet pulled away from his boots. When it came time to end the spacewalk and re-enter the inflatable airlock, Leonov realized he physically couldn't bend his knees or his elbows to pull himself backward into the narrow tube. He was stuck outside the spacecraft, orbiting the Earth at 17,000 miles per hour.
He had to make a decision that essentially violated every safety protocol ever written.
To save his own life, Leonov had to reach down to a pressure valve on his suit and intentionally vent his vital oxygen out into space. He had to dangerously depressurize his suit, bringing it down to a pressure level well below the safety limits, risking severe decompression sickness.
The bends where nitrogen bubbles form your bloodstream and tissues.
Exactly. He bled out the air just enough to shrink the suit's volume so he could forcefully contort himself headfirst back into the airlock. He was drenched in sweat, his heart rate spiking dangerously.
And amazingly, the near-death experience during the spacewalk wasn't even the end of their problems on Voskhod 2.
Not at all. Once Leonov was finally back inside the main cabin with his commander, Pavel Belyaev, the capsule's environmental control system malfunctioned. It began flooding the tiny cabin with pure oxygen, creating an extreme fire hazard where a single static spark could have incinerated them instantly.
It just keeps getting worse.
Then, during the crucial re-entry phase, the automatic landing alignment system failed completely. Belyaev had to manually orient the spacecraft and manually fire the retro rockets, which delayed their descent. Furthermore, the equipment module failed to detach cleanly from the re-entry sphere, causing the spacecraft to tumble violently as it hit the atmosphere.
The descent dynamics were so messed up that they entirely missed their landing zone on the steppes of Kazakhstan.
They overshot by hundreds of miles. They slammed down deep inside the dense, frozen, snow-covered taiga of the Ural Mountains. The capsule was wedged between massive trees. The radio communication was broken. The two cosmonauts had to spend the night huddled in the freezing cold capsule, listening to the howling of wolves outside, waiting for ski rescue teams to hack their way through the forest the next day.
Yet the official Soviet news agencies reported the entire Voskhod 2 mission as a flawless, majestic triumph of socialist engineering. It's staggering. But this era of balancing on a knife's edge is coming to an end. The American engineering machine is waking up. Gagarin's flight in 1961 had fundamentally altered the political calculus in Washington. The United States was tired of playing a dangerous game of catch-up on these small, incremental benchmarks in low Earth orbit. They realized they needed to establish a finish line that was so incredibly far away and so immensely difficult that it would give their industrial base time to build the technology required to definitively win. And that brings us to the ultimate high ground, the race to the moon.
The American decision to go to the moon is heavily romanticized today as a grand endeavor of human exploration, but its origins were deeply rooted in harsh Cold War pragmatism and political survival.
People forget that Kennedy wasn't a space enthusiast at first.
Before Gagarin flew, President John F. Kennedy was actually quite lukewarm on the entire concept of human spaceflight. His own science advisor, Jerome Wiesner, actively opposed sending humans into space, arguing it was a colossal waste of money better spent on robotic probes. In March 1961, when NASA Administrator James Webb presented Kennedy with a budget proposal to aim for a lunar landing, Kennedy flat out rejected it. He thought the price tag was absurd.
So what changes his mind so drastically? Why does he pivot from rejecting the budget in March to standing before a joint session of Congress in May 1961 and boldly committing the nation to landing a man on the moon before the decade is out?
A brutal sequence of political disasters. First, Gagarin's orbital flight happened in April, which caused a massive resurgence of the Sputnik-era humiliation and fear within the American public. The Soviets looked invincible again.
And the second disaster?
Just days after Gagarin's triumph, the CIA-backed invasion of Cuba by exiles at the Bay of Pigs turned into an absolute, humiliating catastrophe. The Kennedy administration was suddenly perceived globally as weak, inexperienced, and incompetent. Kennedy desperately needed a major, undeniable victory to save face and restore the aura of American capability. He sent an urgent memo to his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who also chaired the National Aeronautics and Space Council, essentially demanding to know, is there any space program we can launch that promises dramatic results in which we could win?
And LBJ knows exactly who to ask. He goes straight to the chief architect of the American rocket program, Wernher von Braun.
Johnson tasks von Braun with assessing the playing field. Von Braun replies with a harsh dose of reality. He tells LBJ that because the Soviets possess those massive R-7 cluster rockets, they will easily beat the United States in establishing a multi-person space station or flying a large crew in low Earth orbit. The U.S. just doesn't have the lifting power yet.
But von Braun had a solution.
However, von Braun points out a massive loophole. He explains that flying all the way to the moon, landing, and returning requires a launch vehicle so unfathomably huge that neither nation has even begun to build it.
So aiming for the moon effectively hit the reset button on the entire space race.
Exactly that. LBJ reported back to Kennedy that a lunar landing was the absolute only goal far enough in the future where the United States had a fighting chance to leverage its superior industrial and financial resources, build the necessary super heavy-lift rocket, which would eventually become the Saturn V, and beat the Soviet Union to the punch. It wasn't about science. It was a highly calculated strategic choice of a finish line designed specifically to neutralize the Soviets' existing R-7 advantage.
Kennedy delivers the speech. The American machine gears up. The budget flows. But how did Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev respond to this very public, very direct challenge?
Officially, he responded with absolute silence. The Soviet government adamantly refused to publicly confirm or deny that they were engaged in a race to the moon. They wanted the flexibility to claim they were never trying if the Americans got there first. But secretly, behind the closed doors of the Kremlin, the USSR was absolutely desperate to beat America to the lunar surface. However, their efforts were severely undermined by the very autocratic political system they were trying to prove was superior.
This is a fascinating paradox. NASA succeeded largely because it was this centralized, single-minded entity where everyone pushed in the same direction. But the Soviet lunar program was a chaotic mess of internal fiefdoms and bitter rivalries.
It was a bureaucratic nightmare that stifled innovation. Instead of pooling their finest minds and resources, the Soviet leadership fostered competition, essentially funding two separate, highly secretive moon programs simultaneously. On one side, you had Sergei Korolev, the seasoned chief designer of the R-7, who was developing the massive M1 superrocket and a modified Soyuz spacecraft for a direct lunar landing.
And the other side?
But on the other side, you had Vladimir Chelomey, another powerful aerospace designer. Chelomey had aggressively curried favor with Premier Khrushchev, even going so far as to hire Khrushchev's son to work in his bureau. Chelomey was given massive funding to develop a competing rocket, the Proton, and a different spacecraft intended initially for a crude lunar flyby.
It's like Ford and Chevy building completely different tanks with different ammunition for the exact same army, refusing to share blueprints and actively trying to sabotage each other's funding.
That infighting, combined with an overall lack of funding compared to the blank check given to NASA, ultimately doomed their efforts. The Soviet answer to America's mighty Saturn V was Korolev's N-1 rocket. On paper, the N-1 was an absolute beast. It stood roughly the same height as the Saturn V, but its conical design was intended to produce roughly 28% more takeoff thrust than the American rocket.
But the N-1 had a fatal fundamental engineering flaw at its very base, didn't it? The propulsion system.
It did. American engineers at Rocketdyne had spent years developing the F-1 engine, a single, massive, incredibly powerful engine. The Saturn V only needed 5 of them on its first stage. Soviet metallurgy and engine design couldn't produce a single engine that large without it becoming unstable and blowing up. So Korolev was forced into a complex compromise. To generate the necessary thrust for the N-1, he had to mount a staggering 30 smaller rocket engines in a ring at the base of the first stage.
30 rocket engines firing at the exact same millisecond. The plumbing alone sounds impossible.
It was beyond the capabilities of the time. The fluid dynamics of pumping fuel into 30 engines simultaneously, managing the acoustic vibrations, and dealing with a phenomenon called pogo oscillation, where the rocket bounces on its thrust like a pogo stick, was incredibly destructive. To control it, the Soviets developed a complex analog computer system called KRD. If one engine failed, KRD was supposed to automatically shut down the opposite engine to maintain symmetry and keep the rocket flying straight. But with 1960s computing technology, trying to synchronize 30 screaming engines was a fool's errand.
And the test flights of the N-1 reflect that harsh reality.
They were consistently catastrophic. The N-1 was never successfully flown. It suffered 4 massive consecutive test failures. The most devastating occurred on July 3rd, 1969. Just weeks before Apollo 11 was scheduled to launch, a fully fueled N-1 rocket lifted off the pad. Just seconds into the flight, a loose metal component was sucked into the oxidizer pump of one engine. The engine exploded. The KRD computer system panicked and mistakenly shut down 29 of the 30 engines.
It just shut them all down.
Yes, the 2,500-ton rocket lost all thrust, fell back onto the launch complex, and detonated. A resulting blast was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. It shattered windows miles away and completely obliterated the launch facility. That single explosion secretly doomed any remaining hope the Soviets had of putting a cosmonaut on the moon.
Meanwhile, the United States is charging ahead with the Apollo program. But it's crucial to remember that NASA didn't know the N-1 was failing. The Soviet secrecy meant the U.S. was still terrified they might lose the race at the last second. In fact, that paranoia fundamentally altered the Apollo flight schedule. The mission of Apollo 8 is a perfect example of a frantic rush born of Cold War fear.
Absolutely. During the summer of 1968, the lunar module, the actual lander, was hopelessly behind schedule. The original plan for Apollo 8 was simply to take the command module into low Earth orbit for a shakedown cruise. But the CIA was heavily monitoring the Soviet Zond program.
What was Zond?
The Zond was essentially a stripped-down Soyuz spacecraft designed to launch on Chelomey's Proton rocket, fly a loop around the moon, and return to Earth. In September 1968, the Soviets launched Zond V. It successfully flew around the moon and safely splashed down in the Indian Ocean.
And there were living creatures on board that spacecraft.
Yes, the first Earthlings to travel to the moon and back were a pair of Soviet steppe tortoises, along with some fruit flies and plants. But the mission caused absolute panic in Washington. When U.S. listening stations intercepted the radio transmissions coming from Zond 5 as it rounded the moon, they heard human voices.
Wait, human voices?
For a few frantic days, NASA thought the Soviets had secretly flown cosmonauts around the moon. They eventually realized it was just a tape recorder testing the communication relay, but the threat was clear. The CIA warned NASA that the Soviets might try to put a human in a Zond and fly them around the moon before the end of 1968.
So NASA takes an incredible gamble. They tear up the flight schedule. They decide to take Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders, put them on the very first crewed flight of the massive Saturn V rocket, and send them all the way to lunar orbit in December 1968.
It was an immensely risky acceleration of the timeline, but it paid off. Apollo 8 successfully orbited the moon, delivering that iconic Christmas Eve Genesis broadcast and capturing the famous Earthrise photograph. It established a definitive American lead, and that momentum carried directly into July 1969. Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. We all know the story of the landing. That's one small step for man. But what most people don't know is the wild cinematic subplot happening in the background at the exact same moment. The Soviet Union did not simply concede defeat and watch television.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
In a desperate last-ditch attempt to steal the front-page headlines away from Apollo 11, the Soviets launched an advanced robotic probe called Luna 15. The mission objective was audacious. Luna 15 was programmed to fly to the moon, land softly, scoop up a few ounces of lunar regolith, launch back off the surface, and return to Earth just hours before the American astronauts splashed down.
Wow, really trying to upstage them.
The Soviet propaganda goal was to say, look, we retrieved lunar soil too, but our superior automated system didn't require us to risk the lives of our citizens.
It's an incredible scenario.
Wow.
Luna 15 actually enters lunar orbit just before Apollo 11 arrives. You literally have American astronauts and a Soviet robotic probe sharing the orbital airspace of the moon at the exact same time. The situation was so unprecedented that U.S. officials actually had to reach out to the Soviets and ask for Luna 15's orbital parameters to ensure the two spacecraft wouldn't accidentally collide.
It was one of the very first instances of genuine, necessary space communication between the two superpowers. But the Soviet gamble ultimately failed. Just hours before Armstrong and Aldrin were scheduled to ignite their ascent engine and leave the lunar surface, the Soviet Mission Control rushed the descent sequence for Luna 15. The probe came in too fast, crashed into the side of a lunar mountain, and was destroyed. The Americans had unequivocally won the big race.
But here's an incredibly provocative historical what-if regarding the race to the moon. We view it as this ultimate competitive triumph. But was it always destined to end that way? There's a moment involving President Kennedy that suggests the history of spaceflight could have been radically different.
This raises an important question about missed opportunities. Yes, by late 1963, the geopolitical climate was shifting. The terrifying reality of the Cuban Missile Crisis had sobered both Kennedy and Khrushchev. Furthermore, Kennedy was looking at the ballooning budget for the Apollo program and realizing it was an immense financial burden. In September 1963, Kennedy stood before the General Assembly of the United Nations and actually proposed a joint U.S.-USSR mission to the moon.
A joint mission.
He argued that the cost and the duplication of effort were absurd. As a grand gesture to ease Cold War tensions, he essentially offered to call off the race, pool their technology, and go to the moon together.
How did the Soviet leadership respond to an offer like that?
Initially, Khrushchev's inherent paranoia caused him to reject it. He thought it was an American trick to steal Soviet rocket secrets. But according to later accounts from his son, Sergei Khrushchev, the premier eventually reconsidered. He recognized the immense economic benefits of sharing the cost, and over time, he had developed a cautious measure of respect and trust for Kennedy. He was reportedly poised to officially accept the joint mission proposal in late 1963. But then, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. Khrushchev did not share the same rapport or trust with Lyndon Johnson, and the monumental idea of a joint Cold War peace project to the moon died in Dallas.
It's staggering to imagine an alternate timeline where a Saturn rocket carried both an American and a Soviet to the lunar surface. But history took the competitive path, and that hyper-competitive path had a very dark, fatal cost. While the moon landing is the shining public victory of the era, the background of the 1960s space race was marred by fatal hubris, rushing, and secret military escalations. Let's delve into the darker skies of the late 60s.
Both nations were pushing nascent technology to the absolute physical limits, driven by the unforgiving deadlines set by politicians. And in 1967, that hubris caught up with both programs in horrific fashion. For the United States, the tragedy struck on the launch pad with Apollo 1.
January 27, 1967, a routine plugs-out ground test at Cape Canaveral for the very first crewed Apollo mission. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee are strapped inside the command module atop an unfueled Saturn IB rocket.
To understand the disaster, you have to understand the engineering choices regarding the spacecraft's atmosphere. To save the immense weight of carrying heavy nitrogen tanks and to simplify the plumbing, NASA designed the Apollo capsule to operate on a 100% pure oxygen atmosphere. In space, they only needed to pressurize it to about 5 psi for the astronauts to breathe comfortably. But on the ground during this test, to simulate the pressure differential of space and check for leaks, they pressurized the cabin with pure oxygen to 16.7 psi, greater than atmospheric pressure at sea level.
Which fundamentally alters the chemistry of combustion.
Drastically. In a hyper-pressurized, 100% pure oxygen environment, materials that are normally completely fireproof suddenly become explosively combustible. A stray electrical spark, likely from a piece of chafed wiring near the floor, ignited a fire. In that atmosphere, the fire didn't just burn, it propagated with the speed and intensity of a bomb. Velcro, nylon netting, plastics, everything incinerated instantly. The fire swept across the cabin in seconds.
And the design of the hatch sealed their fate. They couldn't just open the door and get out.
No. They were trapped by a concept called a plug door. NASA engineered the hatch to open inward. The logic was that in the vacuum of space, the internal pressure of the cabin would push the hatch tightly against its frame, creating a perfect seal. But on the launch pad, with a raging fire rapidly increasing the internal pressure of the capsule, the astronauts physically could not pull the door inward against thousands of pounds of force. It was impossible. All 3 men were quickly asphyxiated by toxic gases. The disaster forced NASA to completely halt the Apollo program for 22 months, totally redesign the hatch to open outward in seconds, switch to a mixed nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere for launch, and overhaul their entire culture of quality control.
It was a devastating blow. But incredibly, just 3 months later, the Soviet space program suffered its own fatal catastrophe, driven by the exact same kind of political rushing, the flight of Soyuz 1.
The Soyuz 1 mission in April 1967 was intended to be a spectacular return to dominance for the Soviets. The plan was highly complex. Launch Vladimir Komarov in Soyuz 1, launch a second Soyuz the next day, dock them in orbit, and have 2 cosmonauts spacewalk between the ships. But the Soyuz spacecraft was brand new, incredibly complex, and deeply flawed. The engineers knew it wasn't ready. They had logged over 200 structural and systemic design problems during uncrewed tests. But the political pressure from the Politburo to achieve a major space spectacle in time for May Day was insurmountable. They pushed the launch forward anyway.
Komarov launches alone, and almost immediately the spacecraft begins to die around him.
From the moment he reached orbit, the mission devolved into a desperate fight for survival. One of the 2 primary solar panels failed to unfold, leaving the ship starved for electrical power. This power shortage crippled the environmental control systems and, critically, the automated orientation system. The ship began to tumble. Mission Control canceled the second launch and ordered Komarov to attempt an emergency re-entry.
Komarov was a brilliant pilot. He manages to manually align the crippled ship using the manual thrusters, holding the orientation steady while flying through the Earth's shadow, and successfully fires the retro rockets. He survives the fiery plunge through the atmosphere, but the final failure of Soyuz 1 had nothing to do with the electronics.
It was a mechanical failure. As the capsule plummeted toward the Earth, it deployed its drogue chute, a small parachute designed to pull the massive main parachute out of its container. But the main parachute refused to deploy. The container had become warped during manufacturing, pinching the chute tightly inside. When Komarov realized he was in free fall, he manually triggered the reserve parachute. Tragically, the reserve chute deployed, but immediately became hopelessly tangled with the deployed drogue chute. Without a functioning parachute, the heavy descent module slammed into the Russian steppe at nearly 90 miles per hour. Komarov was killed instantly on impact. He was the first human to die during a spaceflight.
Now, I want to pause the narrative here for a moment because there is a very persistent, dramatic myth surrounding Komarov's death that needs to be addressed. You often hear this story repeated in pop culture, that American NSA listening stations in Turkey intercepted his final radio transmissions, and that as he was plummeting to his death, knowing he was doomed, he was crying in rage, openly cursing out the Soviet leadership and the engineers who built a faulty ship.
It's an incredibly dramatic narrative, but historical analysis of declassified Soviet records, telemetry data, and authentic radio transcripts have thoroughly debunked it. It is a complete fabrication. Komarov remained a consummate professional to the end. His final recorded transmissions were calm and focused on manual alignment parameters. Furthermore, the reality of a parachute failure means he likely didn't even realize he was doomed until the final seconds of the descent. But the persistence of that myth is telling. It reflects the deeply cynical, dark atmosphere of the Cold War era, the pervasive assumption in the West that the Soviet state was carelessly throwing human lives away into the meat grinder of political ambition.
And that cynical atmosphere wasn't entirely unearned. Because while humans were dying in flawed capsules, the military brass of both nations were actively trying to weaponize the very environment of space. After losing the race to the moon, the Soviet Union executed a major pivot. They decided to focus their resources on building long-duration space stations in low Earth orbit. They launched the Salyut program. Now, to the global public, Salyut 1, 2, 3, these were presented with great fanfare as peaceful scientific laboratories dedicated to astronomy and biology.
But underneath the civilian Salyut moniker, a highly classified shadow program was operating. While some of the Salyut stations were genuinely focused on science, Salyut 2, Salyut 3, and Salyut 5 were actually covers for a military program called Almaz. These were highly secretive, crude military reconnaissance stations.
It's the ultimate act of Cold War misdirection. You tell the United Nations, look at our peaceful orbital laboratory. Well, secretly, it's a manned military spy base equipped with massive telescopic cameras capable of reading the license plates on cars in Washington. It's putting a sheep's costume on a wolf and launching it into orbit.
And the militarization went far beyond just passive observation. The Almaz stations were actually armed. Due to Soviet paranoia that American astronauts might fly a spacecraft up and try to board or sabotage the station, Salyut 3 was equipped with a modified Reiter R-23 aircraft cannon mounted to its hull. Before the station was deorbited, ground controllers actually test-fired the cannon into the vacuum of space, proving that orbital combat was physically possible. Furthermore, both nations were actively pouring billions into developing anti-satellite weapons, or ASATs. They wanted the tactical ability to blind their enemy by blowing up their orbital infrastructure. The Soviet Union developed the Istrabital Sputnikov program, which literally translates to satellite destroyer. In 1968, they successfully demonstrated this capability by launching an interceptor satellite, Cosmos 252, which autonomously maneuvered next to a target satellite and detonated an onboard shrapnel warhead, destroying them both.
And the United States wasn't just sitting by watching. They had their own counter program, Project Saint.
Project Saint Satellite Inspector was intended to provide the U.S. with a similar capability to intercept, inspect, and potentially neutralize Soviet satellites. While less is publicly known about its specific mission profiles, and it was eventually canceled due to budget constraints and shifting strategic priorities, the intent of both nations was crystal clear. Space was no longer just a scientific frontier, it was actively being prepared as the next battlefield.
Which makes the diplomatic maneuvers of the late 1960s feel incredibly cynical. Because right in the middle of all this secret military escalation, right after the Soviets successfully blow up a satellite in orbit, and while the U.S. is drawing up blueprints for space interceptors, diplomats from both nations sit down at the United Nations in 1967 and sign a grand peace treaty, the Outer Space Treaty.
The Outer Space Treaty is a fascinating, highly pragmatic document. On the surface, it sounds incredibly mobile. It explicitly bans the placement of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in Earth orbit, on the moon, or any other celestial body. It forbids any nation from claiming sovereignty over space, declaring it the province of all mankind.
But considering they were actively building space cannons and interceptor missiles at the exact same time, isn't the treaty just an exercise in profound hypocrisy?
It's hypocrisy driven by the terrifying logic of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Neither Washington nor Moscow actually wanted the other to park a thermonuclear bomb in orbit directly over their capital city because it would reduce warning times from 30 minutes to 0. That was an unmanageable existential threat. The treaty banned WMDs because it was in both of their survival interests to do so, but notice the glaring loopholes in the text. It did not ban conventional weapons like cannons or kinetic interceptors. It did not ban spy satellites. It did not ban the militarization of space. Both sides mutually agreed to keep the nukes out of orbit so they could safely continue to spy on and threaten each other with conventional orbital weaponry.
It's a very dark, practical kind of peace, a truce born of terror. But amidst all this human paranoia and militarization in low Earth orbit, the robotic programs of both nations were achieving feats of pure, unadulterated exploration deeper in the solar system. While humans raced to the moon, machines raced to the planets.
And in this arena, the Soviet Union achieved spectacular, albeit less publicly celebrated, successes. NASA focused heavily on Mars, sending the Mariner flybys and eventually executing the stunning Viking 1 and 2 landings in the mid-1970s. But the Soviet Union set its sights on Earth's evil twin, Venus. The Venera program stands as an astonishing technical triumph of deep space engineering.
Because landing on Venus is infinitely harder than landing on Mars. Venus is a literal hellscape.
It is arguably the most hostile environment in the inner solar system. The surface temperatures hover around 900 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt lead. Worse, the atmosphere is incredibly dense, composed mostly of carbon dioxide laced with sulfuric acid clouds. The atmospheric pressure at the surface is 90 times greater than on Earth.
To put that in perspective, being on the surface of Venus feels like being almost 3,000 feet underwater in Earth's oceans. It crushes standard spacecraft like empty soda cans.
And that's exactly what happened to the early Soviet probes. They were crushed into scrap metal high in the Venusian atmosphere before they ever got close to the ground. But the Soviet engineers were relentless. They kept iterating, essentially designing their space probes to act like deep-sea bathyspheres. Finally, in 1970, the heavily armored Venera 7 probe survived the grueling descent. It touched down and transmitted temperature data from the surface of another planet for the very first time in human history. Later Venera missions even managed to return the first eerie color photographs from the surface before the heat and pressure inevitably destroyed their electronics. It demonstrated a continued, aggressive Soviet commitment to exploring the cosmos, proving their engineering prowess remained formidable long after Apollo 11.
But as we push through the 1970s, the exorbitant, blank-check budgets of the space race, combined with the shifting political winds of the Cold War, begin to force a massive change in strategy. The era of outspending each other indefinitely was coming to a close. We enter a period of détente, characterized by handshakes in orbit, and the final, lingering echoes of the Cold War rivalry. Détente was a period of deliberate relaxing of political tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Leaders like Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev recognized that the nuclear arms race and the space race were economically unsustainable. They needed a powerful, highly visible symbol to demonstrate this new, thawing relationship to the world. And what better stage for a grand gesture of cooperation than the very arena where they had fought so bitterly? This political mandate led to the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project, or ASTP, which culminated in July 1975.
The plan was elegantly simple on paper. Launch an American Apollo spacecraft with 3 astronauts, launch a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft with 2 cosmonauts, and have them meet and dock in orbit. But technologically, it was a colossal engineering nightmare. It was. These 2 spacecraft were born of entirely different engineering philosophies and were fundamentally incompatible. They operated on different electrical voltages, they used completely different communication frequencies, even the physical docking mechanisms were inherently opposed. The Apollo used a probe and drobe system where one ship was the active male component and the other the passive female. The Soviets understandably refused to let the American ship be the active partner piercing their passive ship, viewing it as symbolically subservient.
So they had to invent an entirely new androgynous docking mechanism where both sides were equal. But the biggest hurdle wasn't mechanical, it was atmospheric, going back to the Apollo 1 issue.
Precisely. The Apollo still operated on a low-pressure, pure oxygen environment of about 5 psi. The Soviet Soyuz, however, operated on a standard sea-level mixture of nitrogen and oxygen at roughly 14.7 psi. If they had simply docked the ships and opened the hatches, the rapid change in pressure and gas mixture would have caused the American astronauts to suffer severe decompression sickness, the bends, or worse.
So how did they solve it?
It required incredible engineering diplomacy. The U.S. agreed to design and launch a separate cylindrical docking module. One end of the cylinder fit the standard Apollo mechanism. The other end featured the newly designed universal androgynous adapter to mate with the Soyuz. But crucially, this module also served as an airlock. The astronauts would move into the module, seal the Apollo hatch behind them, and then slowly adjust the pressure and gas mixture inside the cylinder to match the Soyuz before opening the final hatch. It was a tedious but brilliant solution.
So when we analyze this moment, what does it all mean? The iconic image of American astronaut Thomas Stafford and Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov, the exact same man who nearly died on that first spacewalk reaching through the hatch and shaking hands in 1975, is beautiful. But considering the backdrop, it feels less like a genuine, warm friendship blossoming in space and more like 2 rival corporate CEOs whose companies are bleeding money, who've been forced by their board of directors to merge and are now gritting their teeth and smiling for the PR cameras.
That is a very cynical, but largely accurate, pragmatic view of the event. The ASTP was undeniably a highly orchestrated political stunt driven by earthbound diplomacy. But its long-term importance shouldn't be minimized by its political origins. Even if the smiles were forced for the cameras, the engineering cooperation required behind the scenes was very real. American and Soviet engineers had to visit each other's secret facilities. They developed a universal docking standard that changed spacecraft design. They learned how to link their mission control centers and communicate. That mechanical and diplomatic groundwork, forged in 1975, laid the absolute foundation for the international cooperation we see today.
But détente doesn't last forever. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan happens, tensions flare up again in the 1980s, and we see one final massive echo of the classic space race paranoia. The United States shifts its focus from expendable rockets to developing the space shuttle. The stated goal is reusability, a space truck designed to make reaching a low Earth orbit routine and lower the cost of deploying satellites. Now, history shows that the shuttle program had its own tragic systemic flaws. The complexity of reusability proved far deadlier and astronomically more expensive than NASA hoped, resulting in the devastating losses of Challenger and Columbia. But how the Soviet military leadership reacted to the development of the space shuttle is fascinating.
The Soviet military brass looked at the blueprints and capabilities of the American space shuttle and grew intensely paranoid. They didn't believe NASA's civilian space truck narrative for a second. They saw a massive winged vehicle capable of carrying heavy payloads, maneuvering in orbit, and returning to a precise landing on Earth. To the Soviet mindset, this wasn't a science vessel. It was a highly advanced military space bomber. They believed the Pentagon could use the shuttle to swoop down into the upper atmosphere, drop a nuclear weapon directly on Moscow with zero warning time, and use its wings to glide back into the safety of orbit.
So relying on classic Cold War logic, if the Americans are building a spaceplane, the Soviets must build one too, regardless of the cost.
Thus begins the Buran program in 1974. If you look at a photograph of the Buran spacecraft, it looks like an absolute carbon copy of the U.S. space shuttle. And aerodynamically, it largely was. The Soviet engineers pragmatically figured, why spend billions reinventing the wheel and doing wind tunnel tests when the Americans have already finalized the aerodynamic shape? They stole the external design, but under the hood, the engineering was entirely different. Unlike the American shuttle, which used its own massive main engines for liftoff, the Buran orbiter had no main launch engines. It was essentially a heavy glider strapped to the side of a colossal expendable super rocket called Energia. Furthermore, the Soviet avionics were in some ways superior. The Buran was capable of launching, orbiting, and landing completely autonomously, without a human pilot on board.
But the U.S. intelligence community realized the Soviets were stealing their data, and they played a very sneaky, damaging trick, didn't they?
They executed a brilliant counterintelligence operation. The CIA and the FBI became aware that Soviet spies were acquiring technical documents regarding the shuttle's design. Instead of just blocking the leaks, they actively fed the Soviets highly complex disinformation. Specifically, they altered the mathematical formulas and metallurgical data regarding the shuttle's thermal protection system, the thousands of delicate silica tiles required to keep the ship from burning up during re-entry.
They intentionally leaked bad math, forcing the Soviet engineers down expensive, frustrating dead ends.
Exactly. It caused massive delays and cost overruns. The Buran program ballooned to become the largest, most expensive single program in the entire history of the Soviet space effort. And in the end, it only flew into orbit once. In November 1988, an uncrewed Buran launched, completed 2 orbits of the Earth, and executed a flawless automated landing in heavy crosswinds. But it was never reused. The staggering financial burden of the Energia Buran program, combined with the rapidly failing Soviet economy, was simply too much to bear. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Buran program collapsed with it. The orbiters left to rust in abandoned hangars.
So the Soviet Union falls, the hammer and sickle is lowered, and the Cold War effectively ends. The newly formed Russian Federation inherits the space program, shifting their focus toward their highly successful modular space station, Mir. And in the 1990s, with the geopolitical rivalry gone, the U.S. and Russia finally circled back to the promise of that 1975 handshake. They agreed to the Shuttle Mir program, where American space shuttles docked with the Russian station, which eventually leads directly to the creation of the International Space Station we have today.
Which naturally brings up the grand debate among historians that our analysis highlights. Who actually won the space race? If you view the entire era purely through the lens of John F. Kennedy's challenge the race to land a human on the moon and return them safely, the United States is the undisputed singular victor. The Apollo program was the ultimate demonstration of transparent, democratic, industrial might.
Right.
But as aerospace historians frequently point out, if you zoom out and look at the era as a broad spectrum of aerospace capabilities, the Soviet Union dominated almost every single incremental benchmark. They launched the first satellite, the first animal, the first human, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. They executed the first spacewalk. They built the first space station. They achieved the first soft landing on Venus and the first robotic lunar sample return. The sheer magnitude of the American victory with Apollo 11 tends to overshadow the historical reality that the USSR was actively leading the pack, setting the pace, and driving the agenda for a vast majority of the race.
It's an incredible, complex legacy. Okay, let's pull all of these threads together. We started this journey standing in the ashes of World War II, looking at captured Nazi V-2 rockets that were explicitly designed to obliterate cities. We watched those weapons evolve into towering, terrifying ICBMs designed to threaten the entire globe with thermonuclear annihilation. And yet, through a bizarre alchemy of human ambition and fear, those very same engines of destruction were repurposed. They became the launch vehicles that allowed human beings to step onto the surface of the moon, that sent robotic emissaries into the crushing atmosphere of Venus and the frozen deserts of Mars, and that eventually allowed us to live continuously in orbit on the ISS.
It is the ultimate historical paradox. The greatest collaborative, peaceful scientific achievements of the late 20th and early 21st centuries were not born of peace. They were birthed directly from the intense paranoia, the existential fear, and the bitter ideological rivalry of the Cold War. The rockets were built to carry bombs. We just decided to put people on them instead.
And this isn't just dusty history. It affects you, the listener, right now, today. Every single time you pull out your phone and use the GPS to navigate to a new coffee shop, every time you rely on satellite internet or check a global weather forecast to see if a hurricane is forming, you are directly benefiting from orbital technology that was forged in the fiery furnace of the US-Soviet space race. The invisible infrastructure of our modern connected world was built by engineers who were desperately trying to outsmart a geopolitical enemy.
The space above our heads is no longer an empty, romantic void. It is an active, heavily utilized, essential layer of human civilization, and we owe that entirely to the sheer momentum generated by this era.
But the history we've discussed leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought that feels incredibly relevant today. The geopolitical landscape is shifting again. In the 2020s, aerospace analysts are explicitly declaring that a new space race has begun. Russia recently launched the Lunar 25 mission, attempting to return to the lunar South Pole. The United States is heavily pushing the massive Artemis program, intent on establishing a permanent crewed base on the moon. And now you have a completely new element. Billionaire-backed private aerospace companies entering the fray, launching their own mega rockets and claiming their own territory.
The players have changed, the commercial motivations are different, but the fundamental arena, the desire to control the ultimate high ground, remains exactly the same.
Which begs a fascinating question. Did the space race ever actually end with that forced handshake in 1975? Or did it just go dormant, resting briefly, waiting for the political tensions and the commercial ambitions of a new century to reignite the engines? We started this deep dive looking at the moon as a Cold War battleground. The next time you walk outside at night and look up at that glowing sphere, ask yourself, whose flags will be planted there next, and what kind of rivalry will it take to put them there? Keep looking up, keep questioning the narrative, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.